Good day, and thank you so much for joining. If you're listening to this, I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, I've included my contact, my email address at the end of this, if you wanted to reach out and touch base on any things that are mentioned in this presentation. 4 areas within our objectives that we will cover during this discussion. During the introduction, it's really going to be much about the last 30 years of coaching for me as it relates to this topic. We will go over some literature and we will talk about some terms just in the way of ensuring a common frame of reference. Application in terms of not only things that I have tried that have been unsuccessful, but things that I'm working on and doing now, and then just some final thoughts and considerations towards the end. So why this topic? For me, it's something that I've actually been interested in for quite a while. And not only as it relates to overtraining, but that first paper that's mentioned there, Morgan et al., was a paper that looked at 400 swimmers over 10 years and the connection of overtraining and overload as it relates to psychological challenges, including depression. And then the paper by Stefan et al. Was another paper that impacted me in terms of what athletes go through when they are retiring. So detraining can come in two forms. It can be intentional and it can be unintentional. And we need to consider both ends of that spectrum as it's related to detraining. In 2005, I developed this model as it relates to this topic and looking really at health risks on both ends of the inverted U during distressful times compared or can contrast to eustressors. And in my model, my thinking, my rationale, and again, this is based on the literature, is that we should be revolving between overreaching and undertraining for the most part. And then when we get into periods of either overtraining and detraining, if left unchecked for too long of a period of time, potentially health risks, not only from a physiological perspective, but also a psychological perspective, are part of the possibility of challenges. Now, when I first started to do a deep dive into this topic as it relates to training, overtraining, and detraining, there were no human studies on athletes. The only studies I could find were from this lab in Australia on horses. And if you argue that horses are not athletes, I would challenge you. There are actually some recent papers over the last 3 to 4 years that do a really good job of describing horses as they respond to training. So this is where I started in terms of the literature. At roughly the same time, I also did half a year of study at the Canadian Institute of Stress, and the focused areas of coping, adaptations, and dealing with change and resilience were amazing opportunities for me to learn more about from not only Dr. Richard Earle, who's a researcher at U of T, but also the individual who is the founder of the Institute is Hans Selye. And having an opportunity to do a deep dive in terms of how stress is related to human performance was absolutely invaluable. Certainly review for everybody as it relates to the work of Hans Selye, and that stress is a non-specific response of the body to the demand placed on it, and that source of stress could be either physiological or psychological, and it can come in the form of a eustress or distress depending on our perceptions of that stressor. And again, also review for everybody in terms of the stages of the general adaptation syndrome as discussed by Hans Selye, the alarm reaction, resistance, and exhaustion phases. So that brings us to the challenges of overtraining and detraining. We will talk about planned versus unplanned. Particularly as it relates to detraining. It typically occurs because of a lack of balanced training, which is tied to poor goal setting or unrealistic expectations. Rest and recovery, absolutely critical in terms of overtraining, and then poor monitoring. So we're going to end this discussion on monitoring strategies. Before we talk more in depth about the literature, I wanted to go over just common frame of reference as it relates to terms. So overtraining syndrome, and I've underlined the more important words. Again, it's a state of chronically depressed performance and typically accompanied by one or more serious symptoms. According to the ECSS and ACSM joint position statement, it's essentially a condition of prolonged maladaptation, or a more recent paper last year, excessive training and inadequate recovery. More on that paper from last year, what they actually suggest that the phrase overtraining syndrome could be replaced with a term of paradoxical deconditioning syndrome. And really because there are a cascade of challenges that occur within an athlete and individual going through this challenge. Overtraining would be essentially training and non-training stress. That's important to also distinguish between the two. And there typically is a long-term decrement in performance, and restoration or recovery from this could take weeks to months. A distinction between overtraining and overreaching is that overreaching would incur a short-term decrement in performance, and restoration or recovery would take days to weeks. In the joint position statement that I just mentioned previously, it's a distinction between functional and non-functional overreaching. So functional overreaching would be purposeful, and non-functional overreaching would necessarily be unplanned and not serve a productive outcome. So in this chart from the same position statement, again, what we're looking at more so than anything is the recovery and the timelines. So that the classification of functional and the distinction between functional and non-functional overreaching are clear. And then just in terms of the recovery that it would take in each one of these areas. So we've talked about overtraining, we've talked about overreaching. Now let's talk about the states of training on the left side of this inverted U model. In some cases during undertraining, there may be minor physiological adaptations that occur. In the case of no physiological adaptations or decrements or maladaptation, no change in performance, that would be indicative of a properly prescribed taper. It might occur during periods of active rest. It might occur during periods between competitive seasons as well. And the ideal is that if during competitions or if during competitive seasons, that the loss of physiological adaptations will be minimized. Detraining, however, may incur partial or complete loss of training-induced adaptations, resulting from reduced training or complete removal of training from the athlete's schedule. And again, this could come in the form of unintentional during the COVID challenge, certainly for the first week or so. There might have been situations where training was not able to happen, or versus intentional training, and it might occur at the end of a training season or a calendar year. In this paper, they talk about oxidative stress, and not necessarily as a cause or a consequence. Actually, the paper does a good job of questioning if it is a cause or a consequence as it relates to overtraining and oxidative stress, but also looking at detraining, which essentially abolishes all training adaptations. Bottom line, it still needs to be clarified. This is somewhat of a seminal paper, and if you do have an interest in overtraining, I do recommend that you read it or use it as a starting point. And it does a good job of categorizing overtraining into 4 different areas. For the purpose of this talk, we are just going to cover the first 2. As it relates more specifically, again, just to the physiological and psychological challenge of overtraining in humans, this paper actually does a good job of discussing and describing a review of signs and symptoms of overtraining in humans, despite the fact, and again, this actually is a paper from a journal called Comparative Exercise Physiology. The paper is entitled Overtraining Syndrome in Horses. But again, despite that, it does a really good job in terms of a review and the review of the literature in terms of overtraining in humans. So just to summarize and bring it down to just a few manageable points as it relates to performance and physiological challenges of overtraining. Again, decreased aerobic capacity, decreased time to exhaustion, changes in heart rate. We're going to definitely talk a little bit more about that coming up. Body composition fluctuations, and I've seen this in Ironman triathletes and in a group of Ironman triathletes that I actually studied over the course of a year. Within 3 weeks of their race, of their Ironman, there was significant increases in their sum of skin folds and waist to hip ratio, for example. And again, prolonged recovery, loss of coordination are some of the challenges that arise as a result of overtraining. So back to the heart rate. I said we're going to talk a bit more about that. So with heart rate, here are 3 papers, 3 actually pretty good papers in terms of discussing. The first one is heart rate, a convenient tool to monitor during overreaching. It is a review study. The second one here, again, questioning the value of using heart rate and heart rate monitoring. And then for the practitioners who are working more in a team setting, a good paper just in terms of dealing with heart rate and looking at heart rate as it relates to team training. What I'll do is I'll actually summarize all 3 in one slide. As it relates to changes in heart rate, resting heart rate and heart rate variability tend to be more valid signs of short-term fatigue. And the range is typically anywhere from 2 to 7 beats per minute for resting heart rate. Now, the challenge with this is typical daily variations are going to be in around the range of plus or minus 3 beats per minute. So it really means you have to have a good understanding of the athletes that you're working with. So for example, what I'll do is I look at the Z-scores and obviously the standard deviations with the resting heart rates of the athletes that I'm working with to understand where they should be. And I only calculate their normal and where they should be based on training phases at home with no competitions or travel and very low stress period times. And I'm only able to do that a couple of times during an entire year or calendar year of the athlete's plan because of travel, competitions, tapering, peaking, and then downtimes as well. So you really need to be in tune with the athletes that you're working with. The max heart rate and sub-maximal heart rate tend to be signs of more longer-term fatigue, but the same thing applies. You have to have an understanding of what the acceptable range is, the plus or minus, for the athletes that you're working with. Now, based on the literature, post-exercise heart rate as a measure or a sign of fatigue tends to be less evidence to support that. But it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't be tracking that. I personally do. But that last point, the key is there's no measure of heart rate that can be used as a single assessment or tool for functional overreaching, unfunctional overreaching, or overtraining symptoms or overtraining syndrome, because you need to look at a host of different metrics and tools and measures. This was actually an interesting paper. I quite enjoyed it because it was on triathletes, a group of 24 triathletes, and they split the group up. So for a period of 3 weeks, or a group of 11 of them that went through a more intensified, higher load, higher intensity training. But for both groups, they actually looked at quite a bit. Obviously, they looked at VO2 max, they looked at max heart rate, they looked at their lactates. They also looked at their stride length, their duration on their support leg. They looked at aerial duration, and they also looked at peak vertical force. So they were looking at quite a bit from a performance and physiological perspective. But one thing that was very interesting to me and that caught my interest more so than anything was they also did a cognitive performance test. So they had them running with 2 nunchucks, one in each hand. And if they heard a low-pitched or double high-pitched tone, they had to press the nunchuck in their left hand. However, if they heard a high-pitched or a double-pitched low tone, they actually had to press the nunchuck in their right hand. So it was actually pretty cool. Now, obviously, as you would expect, their cognitive performance was worse in the group that was either overreached or beyond their normal training capacity. Another interesting paper for you, this one published last year. Very interesting because not only is it a longitudinal study, it's a very involved study, but they had 2 control groups. So they did have a group of 14 individuals who were going through overtraining syndrome. They had 25 healthy athletes, but they also had 12 non-active individuals. And why I say it was a fairly involved study is they actually looked at 67 different markers to identify overtraining syndrome. And of interest to me, and why, again, I like this paper is because not only did it focus on immunological, biological or biochemical, physiological or performance decrements, what they were also looking at is the psychological aspect of how it affects individuals during periods of overtraining. So we'll use those two previous studies to transition into more of a discussion in terms of the psychological aspects of overtraining. Now, emotional instability, apathy, decreased self-esteem, irritability, sleeplessness, difficulties concentrating, memory loss, and depression too are some of the challenges of individuals going through overtraining. Now, this is one of the papers that I mentioned at the outset in terms of why this topic interests me, and in part because of papers like this. They looked at 200 men, 200 women, athletes, over the course of 10 years, and used on a regular basis profile of mood states, or POMS. Now, there are pros and cons to using this tool, and there have been pros and cons for the last 25 years of this tool's use. However, in this study, in this paper, what they suggested is that ideally you'd want an iceberg profile so that tension, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion are all lower. However, vigor is higher in an ideal scenario when training is going well. But not only training, but also school, life, social aspects, as opposed to an inverted iceberg profile where tension, depression, anger, fatigue, confusion are all high and vigor is low. So depicting on the right side would be typical of an individual going through challenges with training and psychological challenges. So the one interesting aspect of Morgan et al.'s paper, the previous one I just talked about, is that of the athletes that they looked at, roughly 10% of them experienced overtraining, or in the paper they called it staleness. And 80% of those individuals actually exhibited signs of depression. Now, when you look at the comparison between overtraining and some of the signs and symptoms between overtraining and depression, again, this is why we need to, on a regular basis, look at some psychological measure for the athletes that we're working with, because not only is it going to be physical challenges that are exhibited during periods of high training or high stress, but there also will be psychological aspects during those challenges that we need to be aware of. We are going to move now from a discussion of overtraining to more of a discussion of detraining. Now, skill testing question for you. Some of the signs of overtraining are listed here. Question for you. During periods of detraining, which of the following would you expect to be evident? The answer is all of them. So again, it's critical, not only during periods of high training that we're monitoring our athletes, but also periods of lower training from not only a physiological, but also a psychological perspective. So a call out here to Trent Stellingworth and a former rugby university teammate of mine, Stu Phillips, who recently conducted a webinar on detraining. They did mention this kayak population and group. They did mention this researcher and the team. However, this is a different paper, but on the same population, same athletes in a detraining study. So 14 kayak athletes, 10 were world champion finalists. 2 of them were Olympic gold medalists. They tested them 25 days before Worlds in terms of their physical testing, performance testing. Then they tested them. They did their blood test 5 days before the Worlds. Then they had 5 weeks of detraining, and they tested them after that 5-week period. During the 5-week period of detraining, they actually had 2 groups. The one was reduced training, and the other was complete off from training. The reduced training group, they actually did 3 workouts a week. So they rested on Sunday. On Monday, they did a 40-minute run at roughly 80% of their VO2 max, rested Tuesday. Then they did a bench press, bench pull, squat workout, 3 times 10 at roughly 12 RM, rested Thursday. And then they paddled on Friday with a rest on Saturday. So they did this for the 5-week period. I'll just focus on the changes within their aerobic capacity or VO2 max with these athletes. Now, the paper, when you read the paper, it actually does a really good job of telling you exactly how many sessions they were doing each week during the 47 weeks leading up to the World Championships, not only from a strength perspective, but also from a cardio perspective. They were doing 10 to 15 kayak sessions per week leading up to. But during this study, again, you can see in both cases, if we're looking at their overall VO2 max, the reduced training group lost about 5%, 5.5%, and then just over 11% loss in the group that actually stopped all of training. Now, what I should mention is it's extremely difficult to find detraining studies on humans, let alone training, overtraining, and detraining, the full spectrum within human studies. And here's one other detraining study I was able to find. Again, there's so very few to be able to find. And again, I quite enjoy this paper because I've had the chance, the privilege of coaching a number of different national team Taekwondo athletes over the last 15 to 20 years, one of which was this athlete here, who was Canada's first Taekwondo medal at the Olympics for Canada. So very interested in, obviously, when I was able to find this paper. And what they looked at is 16 Taekwondo athletes and detraining or complete training cessation over the period of 8 weeks. Likely no surprise. In terms of VO2 max decreased by close to 2.5%. Their body fat increased by roughly 21%, and their muscle mass decreased by just over 4%. Again, each of these results are likely unexpected. The challenge or concern that I have with both of the previous studies on detraining is neither of them looked at the psychological aspects of detraining. And I think that there's certainly a lack of literature as it relates to detraining and psychological aspects with training. So that's where I want to go to now in terms of the next study that we're going to talk about. So this is another study by Stefan et al. That I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So what they did is they looked at 32 athletes, 16 of them were transitioning out of sport. They had a comparison or a control group that were still in sport that they matched against, and they looked at them over the course of a year. But some of the challenges and some of the things that they expressed in transitioning. Now, in this case, the transition, the detraining program or detraining period was intentional. They were retiring from sport. They were retiring. They just completed the Olympics and they were retiring from sport, these 16 transitioning athletes. But comments that life, they felt like they'd experienced a loss. There was a huge void in their life. They were tired all the time. They were gaining weight. And one of the recommendations, resounding recommendations in my mind, that really struck me again, that there needs to be a progressive detraining program in place for athletes who are going through intentional detraining. In 2004, I had the privilege of being part of a weekend retreat in Northern Ontario, just north of Toronto, actually, with just over 20 athletes who were all retiring from sport. Now, their retirement was all by choice, so it was completely intentional. And going through the weekend, it was really about the physiological, psychological, social changes that were going to have to be made and adjustments as they were retiring from sports. So there was a nutritionist, a dietitian there, there was a mental performance there, and then I talked to them just about sort of the physical challenges that they were going through, and also to share what a training program would look like in terms of the modifications for volumes and intensities going through detraining. Now, as we are going through this COVID challenge right now, there are athletes who are going to be similar to this group retiring from sport. There are after every major games and every Olympics. The challenge is, and the unknown right now, is there are athletes who are going to retire after Tokyo. But the change in the games has either accelerated their retirement plans or put their retirement plans on hold. And again, these are challenges and concerns that we need to be mindful of with all of the athletes that we work with, especially the ones who are nearing retirement. For example, this past Tuesday, I received an email from an athlete who I used to work with, who I'm still in touch with, that was going to hold on until Tokyo, but has now decided to retire. So again, while the decision to retire is completely his own, the timing is completely different than what was anticipated, and that is going to cause certain challenges and adjustments. If you're interested in a little bit more information about the physiological and performance adaptations as a result of detraining, I will definitely recommend these two papers as excellent resources for you. So that brings us to this last paper I'll discuss just in terms of our literature review. And if you're interested in a study design that involves training, overtraining, and detraining, I recommend you reading this paper. Again, there are very few studies on athletes involving all training states, simply because of the moral and ethical dilemma and challenges of putting athletes through such challenges. However, this study, and it's from the lab in Australia that I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, looks at the adaptations of horses. And again, if you are unfamiliar with the list of top 50 athletes of the century that ESPN put out a few years ago, the Great Racehorse Secretariat is listed as 35 on that list. Again, proof that horses are very much athletes, and interestingly enough, horses do adapt to training in a very similar fashion as humans do. And you can see in these two charts here, graphs here, on the left, you can see their time on the treadmill for the overtrained group was far worse than the control group. And then on the right, you can also see the decrease in their VO2 max over time, especially during overtraining and during the detraining phases. So again, if you're interested in those training states, training, overtraining, and detraining, and as a study design, I certainly recommend you taking a look at this paper. So let's talk about application and monitoring tools, because that's the crux of what our conversation is going to be about. We've all done time trials with our athletes. We've all done tests to exhaustion. We've all looked at tempos and paces and watts. Races and competition results. We're all using GPS and load and counter movement jumps and velocity training depending upon the athletes that we're working with. I think these are all pretty standard. The challenge that I've had over the years is I have athletes not only living in different countries, but obviously competing in different countries and going to different countries and different locations for extended periods of time. So I myself need a method of tracking when they're living and training abroad. So the program that I've been using for a number of years is Training Peaks. And just to give you a macro before we talk about the micro, in terms of monitoring, obviously we were creating the YTPs for the individuals that we're training. But in terms of the programs that I create for them, again, I'm able to see what they're specifically doing every day for each workout that's prescribed, and looking at the distinction between workouts that are prescribed, between workouts that are not completed, between workouts that are modified. So in this slide, yellow means the workout was modified, red means the workout was not completed, green means the workout was completed. The white spaces are simply comments, and then the gray ones are the metrics or added workouts. So from the macro, as in terms of the YTP, to the micro, which could be a week or 2 or 3 of training, to the specific detailed workouts. And again, these are the types of things that I monitor from a performance perspective in terms of helping to prevent overtraining and looking at making sure that there's no detraining occurring. So this is an example of a competitive cyclist that I work with, and he does an FTP test every 2 weeks. And again, for him, it's a true FTP test. He does a ramp for half an hour before the test. And then not only do I look at the end power, but I look at the normalized power for this individual as a performance metric over time. From a physiological perspective, and we're all doing this in one way, shape, or form, looking at heart rates, heart rate variability, maximal heart rate, sub-maximal heart rate, resting heart rate. We're looking at VO2 maxes, anaerobic threshold and step test, and we're looking at anthro. So again, this is something that we're all doing on a regular basis. So here's an example of a few things that I'll track within each athlete's specific training plan. So the first thing is looking at their CTL, or their chronic training load. And that's calculated based on their past 42 days of training in terms of their volume and intensity and loads of what they're doing. The next thing that I'll look at is their acute training load. And again, that's calculated on more of a short-term basis, but both of them are related to their TSB, or their training stress balance score. Now, with each athlete that I work with, we calculate where their CTL and ATL should be based on the training phase that they're currently in. So in this example, this individual was going through a relatively hard training phase, and the expectation that their TSB would be in the negatives. Another indication that it was a challenging phase for this individual was the slight elevation of their resting heart rate. Now, this person's resting heart rate is typically around 43 to 44 beats. So having that +3, +4 beats per minute was expected going through this tougher training phase, in addition to modifications in his heart rate variability. This person also looks at taking a different type of recovery score. He uses a different program that updates automatically. And again, during this training phase in the 60s, we know and expect that, and we have that conversation that that's what's going to be expected. Whereas for this person, when he is tapering and peaking just before a race, his recovery score using this software would actually be in the 90s. However, despite that previous individual having a slightly lower TSB, at no point was it beyond the ranges of where it should be. When I do receive metrics, and this is actually an individual I'm coaching who's looking to qualify for the Boston Marathon, if there are anything that is problematic, then I do get a red sign alert within terms of the monitoring program that I use. And in this case, for this particular individual, it was actually related to a subjective impression of how he felt the training was the day before. So this would have been April 25th. So he was concerned with his April 25th workout, and that his yesterday's training was worse than normal. So we'll use that bit of information to transition and looking at practical monitoring tools from a psychological perspective. So probably the most popular is Hooper McKinnon. I will talk about the rescue. I've already talked about POMS. I'm going to show you how I've used it in the past, and even asking subjective questions such as how do you feel? Now, there is some research to suggest that subjective feelings are more reliable and the most reliable bit of information that you want to monitor over time, as long as the athlete can be honest. And that's the distinction of coaching and knowing where the athlete is giving true and real information or not. Again, with the program that I use, if there are any challenges, so for example, in the previous slide, there was a red flag here. If I look at the dashboard, again, there's a red flag for one individual. I've blocked out all the athletes, so you can't see their names. But there was one, and it was a below average feeling. And this was actually yesterday. It was April 28th. So email the athlete right away, find out what's going on. And she had mentioned to me, she's actually living in Barbados right now, living in training, that the air conditioner had broke. So it actually affected her sleep quality and her overall feeling or mood. So again, in this case, it's a little bit of a blip. It's not a concern. Training does not need to be modified in her messaging back to me today. The air conditioning is supposed to be fixed today, so it's not going to be a problem. But again, having something in place to be able to monitor this on a daily basis in real time is absolutely valuable. If you're interested in a little bit more information, this is a good read, Enhancing Recovery by Kelman. It goes over the REST Q, which is a 76-item questionnaire that gives you a fairly good snapshot of what somebody is going through. So you can see the example. So this is pre-break, the straight line. Everything is slightly skewed in terms of general stress, a little higher, emotional stress, a little higher, physical recovery, a little lower, compared to post-break, where you can see the shifts in each one of these questions or dimensions. So here is a tool that I have used in the past. And in this case, it was with a group of triathletes. Now, I did mention that some of the tools have been successful and some have been unsuccessful. I would say this tool, the compliance was extremely high because the triathletes were amazing and typically amazing at keeping track of detailed information. However, because of the time it took, so it took actually 2 to 3 minutes, and it was an online survey that I had them go to a link to complete it. But in terms of other athletes and other populations, it's not something that I would use because of the additional time that it takes to fill this out. But in terms of the data and what the numbers mean, if you look at the 5 categories on the left, beginning at the top with tension, anger, fatigue, depression, confusion. So if those numbers are low, that's ideal. The 2 numbers just in the middle, or 2 categories or columns in the middle, ERA, esteem-related affect, and VIG, vigor, the higher those numbers are, the better. And in terms of the calculation of the score, the total mood disturbance, or TMD, the higher that score is, the worse. So we want as low as a TMD as possible. So I'll take you just a few things that happened in half a year of training for this particular individual. So the taper started July 15th, 75. That was the second lowest score that the individual had recorded over the course of that 6-month period, which is good. You can see that ERA, or esteem-related affect, was the highest it ever been compared to February. But those are good scores, and you can see that all of the negative scores, tension, anger, fatigue, depression, confusion, all were at 0. Then after that, 2 weeks after that, this individual was actually hit by a car during a final training ride before the Ironman, which would have been an issue if the athlete was injured. Thankfully, just the car was damaged and the bike was damaged. The athlete was completely fine and was able to still race the Ironman. However, there were a bit of challenges just in terms of some fatigue was up a little bit, some vigor was down a little bit compared to when the taper started. His spouse was looking for a job, and that absolutely created some challenges in terms of his psychological well-being. Even more so, his mother-in-law passed away. So again, that absolutely affected his ability to train, and it also affected his scores and his psychological metrics. And then finally, the one thing I'll point out to is the highest score he had all year was as a result of him wanting to buy a new bike, but his wife not approving of the purchase, which caused some tension. It caused anger. It caused a little bit of depression. And this individual was actually medicated for depressive symptoms, and it caused a lot of friction. And the irony is in all of this, the bike that he was on and riding on that July 29th when he was hit by the car was actually the new bike that he had purchased. So at the end of the day, this individual actually had to purchase 2 bikes, which again caused some significant psychological challenges and family dynamics. But hammers home the point and the key of measuring such a metric. I sort of boiled it down to areas that I wanted to look at that give me performance metrics, that give me physiological, that give me psychological metrics as well. And not only with triathletes, but with the majority of the athletes that I work with now. Now, I know most of you, if not all of you, use Hooper McKinnon, which again is a great tool. But what I've done over the last few years is I've actually tailored my monitoring to the athletes that I'm working with. So I will present them with a list and I will say, you know, there's a minimum in terms of what I want. I want something physiological. I want something psychological that you're going to be tracking. From a performance perspective, again, it's going to be completely dependent upon the sport. So in this case, if it's a triathlete that I'm working with, then we're going to do time trials in the pool, on the bike. And again, it's going to be a distinction between 20 to 40K if it's outside and doing FTP tests on the inside. But again, I'm looking at average watts here. And again, time trials running. Again, the time trials will be different and the performance metrics will be different based on the sports that you're dealing with. So here's a perfect example of how it's worked with one athlete that I've been coaching for a number of years. So this particular individual essentially keeps track of just three things: sleep quality, mood, and morning resting heart rate. And I could show you how I use the information because, again, the greatest value in monitoring is how it's going to impact the training that you're prescribing. If you're simply just taking in the information and the data without any useful practicality coming out of it, then I question why you're using it in the first place. So in this example, you can see she suffered the flu. She had the flu for a few days, a couple of days. And in that case, I can see the red, her mood was down, her sleep quality was down, her morning resting heart rate was up. And that little blip required a training modification. So if you recall in a previous slide, with the program I use, I get a little red icon that shows an indication that something's off. Contact the athlete right away on that day, find out what's going on, and training for the next subsequent days was modified. A big blip here in terms of, again, sleep quality, mood was up and down, and resting heart rate was up, then down, then up. But the reality is what happened here is she had a training camp in New York City. Volume of training was high, so expected for some of these metrics to be a little off, but training was not modified. However, on the 16th of November, she suffered food poisoning, and that was this blob, a little blip right here, and then training was modified in that case. And then finally, again, she got the flu shot, and metrics were a little off. Again, just tracking three metrics here. And in that case, training was modified. So it's a fine line being able to disseminate and look at the information that you're getting. And the question of, is it necessary to modify training? In some cases, have you seen, I've shown you, yes, in some cases it might not be necessary to modify training. But that, again, that comes in with the coaching and also the relationship that you have with the athlete. So just in terms of the application and application of the metrics and the tools, again, regular monitoring of performance, psychological, physiological, biochemical, and immunological variables to assess athletes' ability to cope with training stress is absolutely critical. We need to have something in place to be able to do that. As was the focus of this talk, again, just looking at really sort of physiological and performance and psychological variables. Because the reality is, when we return to sport, it's going to be unlike anything these athletes that we work with have ever experienced before. It's going to be unlike anything that we ourselves have experienced before. So how are we making those modifications? Because training right now is completely unconventional. And the perfect example, I have one athlete who is living in Finland right now. He's Canadian, but living in Finland for the last couple of months, as soon as the shutdown happened, was in Spain and moved from Spain to Finland, is being able to train, but he's rigged up this pulley system with these big, massive concrete boulders to be able to do his training. And I've been monitoring him more than once a day. I look a couple of times a day just at the training, because the reality is he's never done this type of training before. He's making the best he can, but I've been looking at his metrics, and his metrics are bang on. His chronic training load and his acute training load are bang on, even with these modifications. So bottom line, take homes. We need to teach our athletes how to listen to their bodies. My personal view, because again, I deal more right now with individual sport athletes. The rugby team that I coach, I'm treating them a little differently, but the reality is, on an individual basis, if we can individualize their monitoring strategies, that is absolutely ideal. Because again, if I give the athletes the choice in what they want to monitor, there's greater adherence because there's greater acceptance in terms of them being part of the decision making. And we need to consider life after sport. The athletes that we work with, we're going to be working with them for a relatively short window in comparison to their lifespan. So when I'm working with an athlete, and the practice and the education and the skills I'd ideally like to impart as part of the education is, again, not only how they're listening to their bodies while they're competitive, but also on an ongoing basis. So not necessarily just making it all about performance, but also making it about health as well. So I've had the opportunity over the years several times to work with athletes who are transitioning out of sport. And these are two perfect examples. The individual on the left, again, was a two-time Olympian and went from amateur status in her sport to professional status to married to having kids to becoming a coach. And again, her transition in each stage was essentially intentional. There were no injuries involved. She had lived a really full career, but the individual on the right actually had a little bit of a different trajectory. So a two-time gold medalist at the Pan Am Games, went to the Rio Olympics, actually retired from sport after the Rio Olympics, married, had a baby, and then decided to come out of retirement. So in her case, we actually went through a training phase leading up to the Pan Am Games in Rio, but we also went through a detraining phase after the Rio Olympics. But then coming back out of retirement, we're now going through a training phase as she prepares for the Tokyo Olympics. So in both cases, again, my consideration, not only with these two individuals, but with every individual that I coach, is I also try and think of them outside and beyond their sport. And what are the strategies and health habits and patterns that we're putting into place, not only to help them as their athletes, but also to help them beyond sport. So final thought I'll leave with you. The prevention of overtraining and maladaptation during detraining can occur with individual monitoring strategies. And again, what I've done is gone over more so of individual monitoring strategies, and certainly amazing opportunities and amazing tools out there right now, not only to monitor individuals, but also to monitor teams and assess how they are adapting to training. So for example, when I'm coaching a rugby team on the very same field, I could invariably have individuals who are 9-to-5 day jobs or others who are tracking towards provincial and national honors. And we need to treat them differently. So having the different types of monitoring strategies in place would certainly be useful. So just in the way of ensuring you have the resources and references if you need, I'm going to show the slides because in some cases I put the paper, in others I just put the author and the year. So here are all of the studies and references and resources that I used for this session. And here's page number 2. Page 3. And page 4. And finally, page 5. Thank you so much. I appreciate you hanging in for the last 45 minutes.